Michael Carter walked along the dark street, where the ghetto seemed frozen in anticipation. Broken streetlights illuminated only shadows, leaving the rest of the street in impenetrable darkness. On the corners, small groups of young men gathered, smoking and drinking, watching silently as anyone daring enough to pass ventured through. No one asked where you were going or why. In this neighborhood, survival came with silence. The sounds of the night intertwined, the creak of old windows, the distant wail of a police siren, the crunch of glass underfoot. Michael, a large man with broad shoulders and calloused hands, barely noticed them. After 14 hours of backbreaking work in the coal mines, fatigue had become his constant companion. Only the gnawing emptiness in his stomach reminded him that it was long past time to get home. A scream tore through the air, sharp and desperate. Michael stopped abruptly, his body tensing. He turned his head, listening. Another scream followed, louder, higher-pitched, filled with fear. Without hesitation, his long strides turned into a determined march toward the sound. As he turned the corner, the scene revealed itself. 5 men, clearly outsiders to this neighborhood, stood around a young girl in a wheelchair. Her pale face was a mask of terror as one of the men, smirking, leaned over her. His blonde hair caught the light of a flickering street lamp, and his rough hands gripped the handles of her chair. "We're just teaching you the rules of our streets, little one," he sneered, shoving the wheelchair slightly, making it wobble. "You understand that, don't you?" Another man nearby lit a cigarette, blowing the smoke in her direction. "She doesn't understand," he said with a mocking tone. "They never do." The girl tried to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Michael stepped forward, his imposing figure emerging from the shadows. He saw the small object clutched tightly in her trembling hands, her eyes meeting his with a silent plea. "Hey!" he called out, his deep voice cutting through the air like a thunderclap. "Let her go." The men turned to face him. One of them, with a scar running down his cheek, gave Michael an appraising look. Their clothes were too clean for this neighborhood, their expressions far too confident. Michael instantly knew they didn't belong here. "This ain't your business," the leader said, his hands still resting on the back of the wheelchair. "We're just talking." Michael took another step forward, his heavy boots thudding against the asphalt. The lamplight caught his rugged face, his eyes cold and unyielding. The man with the scar shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of Michael's presence. The tension thickened. One of the men stepped closer, a smug grin on his face. "Or what?" he asked. "You're outnumbered. You know how this ends, don't you?" Michael didn't respond. He moved swiftly, grabbing the man's collar and throwing him back with enough force to send him sprawling to the ground. Another lunged at him with a knife. Michael sidestepped, twisting the attacker's wrist and forcing the blade to clatter to the ground. A solid shoulder strike sent the man stumbling into a nearby trash bin. The remaining 2 hesitated. Michael's movements were deliberate and precise, each action sending a clear message. The leader of the group, still holding the wheelchair, raised a hand, signaling his men to stop. His smug grin faded, replaced by a scowl. "You just made a big mistake," he said, his voice low and laced with venom. "We'll be back for you." They disappeared into the shadows, their footsteps fading down the street. Michael turned his attention to the girl, who sat frozen in her chair. Her hands clutched a small wooden talisman, her knuckles white from the pressure. Tears streaked her cheeks, cutting through the dirt on her face. Michael crouched in front of her, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "It's over. They're gone." She nodded faintly, but her hands continued to tremble. Slowly, she extended the talisman toward him, her voice barely audible. "This protects me. Now it can protect you." He hesitated for a moment before taking the small wooden figure. It felt warm in his hand, almost alive. He looked at her, seeing both gratitude and fear in her wide eyes. He didn't need to say anything. He simply nodded. That moment etched itself into his memory. Her terrified gaze, the trembling hands, the small token she offered, everything spoke of the vulnerability and injustice that had plagued this neighborhood for far too long. Michael knew this was no coincidence. It was a challenge not just to him but to the entire community. and he understood with unwavering certainty that he could not ignore it. Michael Carter walked along the street where even the air felt heavy. The smell of dampness mixed with burning rubber hung between the crumbling buildings. The cracked sidewalks, littered with trash, mirrored the decline of the neighborhood. People stayed out of sight, their silhouettes barely visible behind curtains, doors locked tight. No one wanted to be a part of whatever was brewing, a fear that loomed over the streets like a storm. Approaching the small market, he noticed clusters of neighbors gathered at street corners, their hushed voices carrying on the wind. Eyes flicked toward him, some with averted gazes, others with silent accusations. Snippets of conversation reached his ears. It was clear the fight from the previous night had become the talk of the neighborhood. "He's stirred them up, and now we're all going to pay for it," a woman muttered, casting a wary glance in his direction. "Should have just kept walking. Now they'll never leave us alone," another voice replied. Michael felt the weight of their judgment but paid it no mind. His thoughts were elsewhere. Ever since he had confronted Brandon and his men, questions lingered. These men were not locals. Their confidence, their mannerisms, their tactics, everything pointed to something larger. This wasn't random violence. It felt like a power shift. A new gang had claimed the neighborhood, and they intended to make their presence known. As he reached Mr. Gomez's store, Michael noticed the window was now riddled with fine cracks. It had been intact just yesterday. The faint chime of the doorbell broke the silence as he stepped inside. Mr. Gomez stood behind the counter, his thin face etched with worry. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, his shoulders more hunched. "Carter," he said without looking up. "Your bravery's made things worse." Michael approached the counter, his eyes scanning the scratches on the wall. "They came here, didn't they?" A heavy sigh escaped Gomez's lips. "They threw a rock, broke the window, left their little messages. Said if I open tomorrow, I won't have anything left to sell. You're in their way, but we're the ones paying for it." The words stung, but Michael knew the blame wasn't his. These men weren't just here to intimidate. They were here to claim ownership, to control, to make everyone submit. But the fear in Gomez's voice was palpable, a reminder of how deeply it had taken root. Outside, the street seemed quieter, as though the neighborhood itself held its breath. A boy sat on the steps of a nearby building, his shirt stained and his hands stuffed in his pockets. Michael nodded at him, but the boy didn't respond. His blank stare spoke volumes. It was the look of someone who had already accepted defeat. When Michael returned home, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. On the porch stood Rosa and her daughter, Rebecca. Rosa's face was filled with nervous gratitude, while Rebecca clutched her small backpack tightly. "We wanted to thank you," Rosa said. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what might have happened." Rebecca stepped forward, her thin frame trembling slightly as she held out a small bracelet with a wooden charm. "This protects me. Now it can protect you," she said softly, her eyes dropping to the floor. Michael took the bracelet, feeling its smooth texture against his calloused fingers. It was a simple object, but her gesture carried a weight far beyond its size. She was offering him her trust, her belief that he could protect her and everyone else. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes briefly before she looked away. After they left, Michael sat on his porch, turning the bracelet over in his hands. His thoughts churned. Responsibility now rested on his shoulders. Fear couldn't win, not in him, not in this neighborhood. If Brandon and his men thought they could break this place, they were wrong. The bracelet sat in his palm, a small but powerful reminder of what was at stake. The shattering sound jolted Michael awake. A pungent, acrid scent filled the air, scratching at his lungs. He stood, scanning the room, eyes landing on a faint glow creeping through the edges of the window. Flames licked the porch outside, casting dancing shadows against the walls. The crackle of burning wood punctuated the silence, a grim reminder that danger had arrived. Grabbing the bucket near the back door, Michael rushed outside. The heat struck him first, wrapping around his skin like a suffocating blanket. Flames consumed the trash bin and reached the wooden railing of the porch. Water splashed against the fire, hissing as it fought the embers. Smoke rose in dense columns, but the danger wasn't just the flames. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, stepping into the flickering light. One carried a length of pipe, another swung a chain lazily at his side. The third, standing behind them, exuded authority with his quiet stance. His cold, sharp gaze locked on Michael, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You still don't understand who's in charge here, Carter," the leader said, his voice cutting through the crackling fire. "This is just the beginning." Michael straightened, the bucket clattering to the ground. His fists clenched instinctively. The fire behind him was a threat, but these men were worse. He could see it in their posture, their confidence. They were here to make a statement. "You brought this to my home," he said evenly, his voice low and steady. "Now you leave." The leader's smirk widened, but he didn't move. Instead, he gestured to one of his men, who lunged forward with the pipe. The swing was wild, missing its mark as Michael stepped aside. A quick strike to the attacker's ribs sent him staggering back. The second man advanced, the chain slicing through the air. Michael caught it mid-swing, yanking it hard enough to pull the man off balance. He fell to the ground with a thud, leaving the chain in Michael's hands. The leader watched, unmoving, his expression unchanged. His men were recovering quickly, and Michael barely had time to react when the first one came at him again. The pipe struck his side, and pain shot through his ribs. He stumbled, catching himself against the porch railing, but he didn't fall. His breaths came in sharp bursts, but he forced himself to stand. The fight continued in brutal silence, each move calculated and precise. Michael's elbow met the jaw of one attacker, sending him sprawling. A knee to the chest of the second left him gasping on the ground. Blood trickled down Michael's side, but he didn't let it slow him. The leader finally stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He didn't raise a hand, didn't draw a weapon. Instead, he simply spoke, "You're strong, Carter, but strength won't be enough. Next time, it'll be the girl." The words landed like a blow. Michael's grip on the chain tightened, his knuckles whitening. He took a step forward, but the leader turned away, signaling his men to follow. They retreated into the darkness, their footsteps fading, leaving only the smoldering remains of the fire and the suffocating stench of burnt wood. Michael stood motionless, staring after them. The weight of the leader's words pressed down on him. He knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just about him. It was about the neighborhood, about Rebecca. They wanted to break him, to prove their dominance. Lights flickered on in nearby houses, silhouettes appearing behind curtains. Eyes watched from the shadows, silent and unmoving. No one came out. No one offered help. The chain slipped from Michael's fingers, clattering to the ground. He leaned against the porch railing, his breath slowing as the adrenaline faded. Pain throbbed in his side, but his mind was fixed on a single thought: they would come again. And next time, they would go after her. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a declaration of war. Michael Carter sat in his house, leaning his elbows on the table. The ache in his side from the pipe strike lingered, a constant reminder of the fight. The scent of smoke, now embedded in the walls, filled the air. The image of the burning porch and Brandon's face refused to leave his mind. His words, a cold and calculated threat, echoed relentlessly. This was no time to wait. The fear that had spread through the neighborhood needed to be confronted. The phone in his hands felt heavier than usual. Leah Thompson's name stared back at him. It had been years since they last spoke. She used to live in this neighborhood, writing boldly about corruption, drugs, and the oppression that plagued places like this. Her work had been fearless, though it often came at a cost. She was the only person he could think of who might be willing to help. His fingers dialed the number. After a few rings, her voice answered. It was familiar, steady, but tinged with surprise. "Michael? I didn't expect to hear from you." She listened intently as he described everything: the gang, the arson, the threats, the suffocating fear gripping the community. She interrupted only once. "You understand how dangerous this could be? Stories like these don't end cleanly, Michael." "It doesn't matter anymore," he replied. "If we don't act, they'll destroy everything." Leah arrived in her old, battered car not long after. She stepped out with her camera and a small notebook, her determination palpable. She examined the charred remains of the porch, taking photos and jotting down notes. The lingering scent of burnt wood seemed to fuel her resolve that on the next block, she stopped in front of Mr. Gomez's store. The cracked window and slurs spray-painted on the walls became her focus. Inside, Gomez stood behind the counter, his face lined with exhaustion and worry. Her questions were sharp and direct, but his responses were reluctant until he looked directly at Michael and said, "You don't understand what you're doing. They'll kill us all." The words hit harder than Michael expected. He already knew the fear that gripped his neighbors, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a blow. Leah didn't stop. She interviewed other residents, photographed the damaged facades, and recorded every detail. Most people, however, turned away at the sight of her camera. They avoided her, slipping away as if her presence alone might invite trouble. "They're too afraid to speak," Leah said, lowering her camera. "They have every reason to be," Michael replied. "But we can't stop now." A few days later, Leah's article was published. It detailed the gang's rise in the neighborhood, their methods of intimidation, and the destruction they left in their wake. Photographs of Michael's burned porch, Gomez's shattered storefront, and the eerily empty streets accompanied the story. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some residents felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone had spoken out. Others viewed it as a provocation, certain it would only anger the gang further. Not long after, Leah received her first threat. An anonymous number sent a text, "Stop now or you'll regret it." She told Michael about it with a strained smile, brushing it off as if it were nothing. But when her car tire was slashed the next morning, her silence spoke volumes. Michael watched as she pulled a spare from her trunk, her hands moving with quiet efficiency. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave him was enough. She understood the stakes, as did he. The neighborhood remained silent, windows illuminated with the faint glow of watchers peering out from behind curtains. Fear held them captive. Every shadowy figure behind glass seemed to accuse him of bringing this chaos to their doorstep. Michael felt the weight of their silence pressing down on him. He knew Leah was right. This was just the beginning. The abandoned warehouse, overgrown with weeds, stood silent as people trickled in. Each step felt heavy, as though they were walking into a space that could betray them at any moment. The walls, cracked and stained, let in a chilling wind that amplified the unease in the room. Around 20 people had gathered, their movements hesitant, their gazes wary. Fear clung to the air like smoke. Michael stood against the wall, watching as the small crowd murmured amongst themselves. Their voices were low, their words cautious, as if even this place wasn't safe. Mr. Gomez was among the first to arrive, his hunched shoulders a physical manifestation of his anxiety. A pair of young men stood near him, their expressions a mix of skepticism and unease. A mother clutched her child's hand tightly, her eyes darting to every corner. Suggestions were thrown into the air, each one met with hesitance. Board up doors. Patrol the streets. Document the gang's movements. But every idea was weighed down by the oppressive knowledge that resistance might bring retaliation. Fear had wrapped its tendrils around them, binding their courage. The door slammed open with a metallic groan, silencing the room instantly. Brandon entered, his boots echoing against the floor. 4 men followed him, their faces partially obscured by hoods, their hands gripping weapons, pipes, chains, a bat. The people in the warehouse recoiled, some stepping back instinctively. Brandon stopped in the center, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory calm. His presence was suffocating, his silence more threatening than words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that pressed against the room like a vice. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His message was clear, they were alone and he was in control. The residents froze, their fear evident in every motionless limb and averted glance. Michael could feel the weight of their terror pressing down on him, a suffocating reminder of how isolated he was in this fight. Brandon turned his gaze toward him, smirking. He didn't need to say much more. His dominance was unshakable. When Brandon left, the warehouse emptied quickly. People shuffled out, heads down, murmurs of hopelessness following them into the night. Michael stayed behind, his fists clenched, his mind racing. He knew the first step had been taken, but it felt like a hollow victory. The sharp cry shattered his restless thoughts, pulling him from the fragments of sleep. His heart pounded as he threw on his shoes and ran outside. The sound of desperation cut through the silence of the street, guiding him like a beacon. His legs carried him toward the source, faster than he thought possible. At the end of the block, he saw the car. The back door was open, and 3 men wrestled Rebecca into the seat. Her wheelchair lay discarded on the sidewalk, one wheel twisted and broken. She struggled, her cries piercing the night, but one of the men silenced her with a hand over her mouth. Michael sprinted toward them, but the car roared to life. The tires screeched, leaving black marks on the pavement as the vehicle sped away. He chased it, pushing his body to its limits, but the distance grew. The taillights disappeared around a corner, leaving him standing alone in the empty street. Breathless, he looked around. The stillness of the neighborhood mocked him. Behind dark windows, shadows moved, watching but never intervening. The wheelchair remained where it had fallen, the broken wheel spinning slowly. He picked it up, setting it upright as if that might somehow undo what had just happened. His hands shook, his chest heaved, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt powerless. Brandon had gone too far. This was no longer intimidation. It was war. Michael sat at the edge of the table, holding Rebecca's bracelet. The small wooden charm felt heavier than ever, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Desperation lingered in the room, silent but palpable. Across from him, Leah flipped through her notebook, her calm demeanor betraying the tension she was trying to suppress. The streets outside remained the same, windows shut tight, footsteps muffled, the occasional crunch of broken glass under hurried feet. The neighborhood's fear had become its defining feature, suffocating any thoughts of resistance. Detective Williams arrived late, his tired expression blending seamlessly with the worn streets. He listened without interruption as Michael and Leah detailed everything: the arson, the threats, the kidnapping. His face betrayed no emotion, but his body language spoke volumes. This wasn't going to be easy. When he finally left, Michael knew what needed to be done. The detective's message was clear: law enforcement would only act if they had undeniable evidence and a clear opportunity. That meant luring the gang into a trap. Leah got to work immediately. Maps of the neighborhood, notes on the gang's movements, and photos of the damage covered the table. Michael studied them alongside her, though his mind was consumed by thoughts of Rebecca. He couldn't shake the image of her being dragged away, helpless and terrified. Residents began to share information slowly, cautiously. At first, it was vague, passing mentions of suspicious activity or fleeting observations of gang members. But over time, the details grew clearer. Someone reported trucks unloading crates at an abandoned warehouse. Another mentioned seeing Brandon's men entering and leaving the area late at night. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. The neighbors' attitudes began to shift. They realized that staying silent only made them more vulnerable. Small acts of cooperation emerged, someone offering to keep watch, others noting down suspicious movements. Fear still lingered, but it no longer paralyzed them completely. Michael decided to investigate the warehouse himself. Pulling on his jacket, he headed to the outskirts of the neighborhood. The building loomed ahead, its concrete walls scarred by time and neglect. It looked abandoned, but as he approached, he noticed signs of recent activity. Tire tracks crisscrossed the dirt leading to a partially open gate. Hiding in the shadows, he observed 2 men unloading crates from a van. Their movements were quick and practiced, indicating they had done this many times before. A third man emerged from inside the warehouse, holding a radio. The way they operated confirmed Michael's suspicion. This was a central hub for their operations. His heart stopped when he saw a faint light from within the building. A familiar silhouette appeared in the doorway. Squinting, he recognized the disheveled figure of Rebecca. She moved hesitantly, pushed forward by one of the men. Within seconds, she disappeared back inside. Michael clenched his fists, the urge to act almost overwhelming. But he knew this wasn't the time. Any rash decision could put Rebecca in greater danger. He took a step back, retreating carefully into the shadows. His priority was to gather more evidence and share it with Leah and Detective Williams. On his way home, his thoughts churned relentlessly. Time was running out. The warehouse was the key, both to Rebecca's rescue and to dismantling the gang's hold on the neighborhood. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. Michael sat in the darkness of his home, still unable to believe that everything had led him here. The ambush was set, and despite the police's readiness, he felt that something would go wrong. In his mind, the past few weeks replayed. Every step had felt like a coiled spring, tightening with each move. His hands tightened around Rebecca's bracelet, and for a moment, he felt the weight of their lives hanging by a thread. He knew that there was no turning back now. Rebecca was his priority, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Leah sat across from him, her eyes glued to the clock. The fear wasn't just in Michael, it was in her too. Every glance, every movement in the dark room was heavy with anticipation. She held the phone, receiving the last messages from Detective Williams. Everything was ready, but the unknown remained. When they arrived at the location, the warehouse appeared just as it had in their plans, empty, forgotten. But from around the corner, right in front of them, a group of Brandon's men immediately noticed their surveillance. It was a mistake. Michael knew their actions had been too obvious. Moments later, the air was shattered by the first gunshot. The return fire, the explosions, and suddenly, what was supposed to be their victory turned into a battlefield. Gunshots echoed through the warehouse, and shouts mixed with the flashes of light from the bullets. Michael surged forward. There was no time to think. He knew that Rebecca was nearby, and he couldn't leave her there. Each step, each dash, was filled with danger. He saw police and gang members exchanging fire, but Michael fought through it, step by step, getting closer to what mattered, Rebecca. When he finally reached the warehouse, where she had been kept, he saw her. Rebecca's dark eyes searched for him through the chaos. She was tied to a chair in a corner of the room, and the place was a mess, but she was alive. He didn't waste a second. He tore the ropes apart, freeing her, and they began to move, risking every step. He knew this wasn't over, there would still be people after them. But just as Michael was helping Rebecca out, he noticed Brandon slipping through the back door of the warehouse. He was ready to flee, abandoning his men to their fate. Michael knew that this was an opportunity he couldn't let slip. He chased after Brandon, not thinking of the consequences, not caring about the gunfire and dangers surrounding him. He knew that Brandon was more than just a threat. He was the symbol of everything they had been fighting against. The abandoned streets felt like a fog. Michael felt his breath grow heavier, but he couldn't stop. He knew that Brandon was ahead, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Time was running out. He kept searching for Brandon, running through empty yards, sliding through dirty alleyways. He could hear footsteps ahead. Brandon was close. But as Michael got closer, Brandon, as always, was one step ahead. He slipped into a car, and without looking back, sped off at full speed. Michael was too close to give up, but it was too late to stop him. The car disappeared around the corner, leaving only dust and fog, traces on the road. Michael stopped, breathing heavily. His fingers clenched, but he couldn't afford to fall apart. Brandon had slipped away, but his time was not yet up. This was just his victory, and Michael knew the continuation of the fight was still ahead. Michael stopped in front of the old building. The dust under his nails, the steady breath filling his chest, and the fire burning inside him all merged into one singular moment. He knew Brandon was inside, and he knew that whatever happened next would settle everything. One final fight, one final victory or defeat. There would be no turning back. The building was aged, with broken arches and windows sealed off with wooden planks. Inside, the air smelled of rust and dampness, but Michael didn't care. Every step he took felt like a countdown to what had to happen next. The struggle that had brought him here, the violence, the fear, he couldn't let it continue. The only sound in the darkness was the soft echo of his footsteps. The building felt like it was swallowing him whole, but there was no hesitation. Every move he made was guided by one thing, ending this once and for all. Suddenly he heard a sound. Brandon was standing in the far corner, his figure barely visible in the darkness. He didn't try to hide. He knew Michael was coming. They would meet here at the very end. Brandon didn't move. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, a cold smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't running. You can't change the system. His voice was calm, almost detached. Everything you do won't matter. It's always been this way, and it always will be. We are the ones in control here, and you can't stop us. Michael didn't need to hear any more. He stepped forward, his breath steady, but his voice firm. The system starts changing with us. His words hung in the air like the first crack of thunder before a storm. There was no more time for words. This was the moment. This was the end of it. Brandon laughed darkly and took a step toward him, slow, deliberate, as if he held all the power. Without warning, he lunged, trying to knock Michael off balance, but Michael was quicker. He sidestepped, landing a powerful punch to Brandon's stomach, sending him stumbling back. The fight erupted in an instant. The sound of fists, grunts, and bodies hitting the floor echoed in the empty room. Every move was a test of will, a struggle for dominance. Brandon tried to counter, but Michael was faster, landing blows with precision, each hit pushing him forward. With a final, forceful shove, Michael threw Brandon against the wall, pinning him there. The fight was over. Brandon gasped for breath, his arrogance faltering, his eyes betraying fear. "You won't win," Brandon gasped, struggling to break free, but Michael held him firm, his hand tightening around Brandon's throat. "I already have," Michael replied, his voice low but resolute. The fight was over. But as he stood there, staring at Brandon's defeated body, Michael felt an emptiness settle in. The victory was hollow. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He pushed Brandon away and stepped back, still catching his breath. But even as Brandon lay motionless on the ground, Michael knew that the battle had just begun. He turned and walked out of the building, his eyes fixed on the dark streets ahead. The fire inside him burned brighter than ever. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the war. The arrest of Brandon and his gang marked the culmination of a long, painful journey. The police, finally making decisive moves, acted quickly and with precision. Brandon and his men were apprehended, but the feeling of relief was fleeting. The weight of the tension still lingered. This wasn't a victory, it was just a hurdle overcome. Michael stood from a distance, watching as the police took Brandon and his men away. His gaze was steady, but his mind remained sharp. It wasn't a celebration. There was no joy. The battle was far from over. The neighborhood was still fractured, broken by years of violence, fear, and distrust. The real work, the rebuilding, had only just begun. The streets were still littered with the remnants of their struggle. Abandoned buildings, shattered windows, broken doors, every corner screamed of the chaos that had ruled their lives for too long. But that was just the surface. Beneath it all was something deeper, a sense of loss and weariness that would take much longer to heal. Despite the arrests, the neighborhood was not going to bounce back overnight. Yet, change was slowly starting to take hold. People who once hid from danger began to come out. It wasn't easy, and there was still fear in their eyes, but the willingness to act, to rebuild, was evident. Michael knew that this was more than just cleaning the streets. It was about trust, about slowly, carefully, showing each other that they could rely on one another. One of the first to step forward was Mr. Gomez, whose hands trembled with age, but whose eyes still held the fire of a younger man. He offered to help organize the neighborhood patrols. Together with a few others, they set up nightly rounds, ensuring that no new threats could creep back in. It wasn't just about safety, it was about proving to themselves that they were no longer powerless. They weren't just surviving, they were reclaiming their community. Homes began to be repaired. Roofs were fixed, windows replaced, walls repainted. Families came together, picking up the pieces of their broken lives. Young and old worked side by side, slowly restoring the place they once called home. The noise of hammers and the murmur of voices filled the air. There was no longer just silence. Now there was action, cooperation, and hope. Michael joined the patrols, continuing to work long into the night. He knew the fight wasn't over. Arresting Brandon was just a temporary win. People had to see that safety wasn't something that would simply fall into place. It was something they would need to build together, every single day. And the foundation had to be solid, built on trust and unity. As he walked through the neighborhood, He saw Rebecca teaching children at the playground. She had become one of the first volunteers, giving her time to help the younger kids grow. He stood back for a moment, watching her as she interacted with the kids. She was confident now, no longer the scared girl she had once been. When she noticed him, she came over. Michael smiled at her, the weight of their shared journey heavy between them. "We pulled you out of hell," Michael said, his voice firm but filled with warmth. "Now your job is to grow up and make this world a better place." Her eyes shone with understanding. She had accepted the responsibility. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a part of the future, and that future depended on her. She understood what needed to be done, and she was ready. Michael watched her with pride. He knew they had won something much bigger than just a fight against Brandon. They had won the chance for a new life, for themselves and for the future generations. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving. With Rebecca at the forefront, with people like her, there was no limit to what they could achieve. And Michael knew, as he turned to walk back toward the center, that the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning, and now, they had the strength to face whatever came next.